It's drizzling, so I will wait for it to stop. I'm just going to read some extracts from a very good book called Sailing Just for Fun. It's by a chap called Charles Stock, who is a bit of a god from where I come from. He's dead now, he died last year, but he sailed for about 40 years in a 16-foot boat, no engine, all around the Essex coast. Well, let me read the back. High adventure on a small budget is Charles Stock's philosophy as he cruises his midget 16-foot gaff-rigged sailing cruiser Shoal Waters on the Thames estuary with 68,000 miles logged since 1963. No engine, no electronics. The art of pottering taken to its zenith and happiness achieved with a great simplicity. There's a lesson here for all of us who hanker after the South Seas. This was sent to me by a chap called Stephen Stewart, who is also an East Coaster. It's got one of the worst maps of the Thames estuary I've ever seen. This is a book for a man who has read all the how-to books and still finds that he cannot. It is unashamedly simple, basic and old-fashioned. In it I dwell on my own area, the Thames estuary, and my own little gaff cutter Shoal Waters, for these are the things that I know about. The reader will find no reference to ship-to-shore radio, kicking straps, self-steering gear, or even engines, for I use none of them in my maritime wanderings. I don't say that you shouldn't have them, just that they're not absolutely essential and are very expensive. You'll find no mention of safety equipment as a separate section, for I regard everything on the boat from truck to keel as part and parcel of my safety equipment. It's an interesting point that pre-war sailing books never mention life jackets or flares, and I have none. Good on you, Charlie boy. I regard Terraline sails and ropes as God's greatest gift to sailors, second only to leak-proof, hot-moulded hulls. Well, you're right there. I mean, we do have immortal sails. We've now got immortal hulls in fiberglass, so that's even better. Wood has soul, but fiberglass has immortality. What would I choose, a soul or immortality? We are easily the luckiest sailors ever to have existed. I mean, we have immortal boats, we have great sails, we have perfect navigation, we have perfect weather forecast 3 days out, and we have Beam Me Up Scotty. We have reliable engines. Couldn't be better. Couldn't be better. The boats I meet around the coast seem to be bigger each season. There's no doubt that larger boats give better accommodation, in particular, sufficient room to invite guests to join you for a cruise, but do they give you more and better sailing? I think not. Many of us with dreary, undemanding jobs want some sort of challenge when we go afloat. I find a 60 or 70 mile weekend trip a deeply satisfying achievement. The same trip in a 40-foot boat is just a milk run. Remember that the sheer joy of using the wind to travel in delightful maritime surroundings is the main object of the exercise. We must have a life support system, but it can be a capsule rather than a caravan. During the 1975 season, Shoal Waters sailed some 40 weekends and I averaged 80 miles a weekend. Of course, I spent a lot longer underway, but then I like sailing. The difference is that the large boat, once it arrives, anchors or picks up a mooring and stays put until it's time to set off home. The small boat, after recovering from the initial trip to another creek or river, can get underway again near high water to explore one of the interesting creeks in the upper drying reaches. Large boats could do the same, for trading craft drawing at least 6 feet when fully laden visited mills, wharves and farmers' landing places, which are still to be found in such delightful areas. But somehow, large yachts seldom do. You know, often when I sail past blokes at anchor at the entrance to a creek, I feel rather sorry for them. I regard them as being depth challenged. When bad weather comes along, life can get pretty grotty, cooped up in a very small boat, whether in harbour or underway. It's the old story. You pays your money and you takes your chance. He is right. You know, I mean, that's when the worm turns, is when it's bucketing down with rain and you're sitting down below, crouching down below. People ask me what it's like being on living on such a small boat. I mean, this is a big one. This is 26 feet. But when I'm on the little one, when you were a kid, you may remember that you used to make a kind of camp under the dining room table with curtains or towels hanging around. It's like living there for 48 hours. Not nice. Now, he talks about the Thames estuary. I suppose that the Thames estuary starts somewhere between Shoeburyness on the Essex shore and Sheerness in Kent, for hereabouts the sailor who has travelled down from the historic port of London realises that the shore is falling away on either hand. Suddenly he is facing a very wide area of open water. The high ground of the Isle of Sheppey remains a comforting sight away to the south, but the low sea wall protecting the Essex marshes soon fades away in the north. There are another 25 miles of Kent running due east to the North Foreland, and one of the only 2 lighthouses in the area. It's 45 miles northeast to the other one on a low shingle spit called Alford Ness. An imaginary line between those 2 points, bulging in the middle to take in the drying sand called the Kentish Knock, completes a triangle containing some 500 square miles of prime sailing water. Add 12 widely differing rivers with a total navigable length of some 180 miles, a further 25 miles of canals, spatter some 30 or 40 sandbanks offshore, spice the whole lot with the relics and traditions of 2,000 years of warfare, trade and fishing. Top up with prevailing offshore winds, the best summer weather in Britain, yes, that's for sure, together with gentle but useful tides that come and go in logical fashion, and you have something approaching the ideal playground for small boat sailors. There's another important feature that is largely unrecognised: the shock absorber effects of the drying banks as they emerge from the sea twice a day. Perhaps the worst time to be at sea in a small boat is after a long blow, when the heavy swell persists and shakes the wind out of the sails, so that the boat can't maintain steerage way. Such a swell can last for days in some areas. In the Thames estuary, all that energy is dissipated in surf on the sands, and the swell has often gone 24 hours after the wind eases. Hadn't really occurred to me. There are many centreboard boats whose plate stows in the keel. He's talking about cruising yachts now for the area. There are many centreboard boats whose plate stows in the keel rather than intrudes in the cabin. This enables them to sail in shallow water, but they lose the advantage of being able to dry out level enough to live on board. Bilge keels, or twin keels as they are sometimes known, provide something of a compromise, and have sold in thousands over the last 25 years. But they lack the performance of keel or centreboard boats. That's true. The small centreboard can draw as little as 12 inches with the plate up, and this makes it easy for her to find drying mooring and leave it early on the returning flood. Many mariners have a drying sill at the entrance. The centreboard boat will be first in every time. Much more important to my sort of sailing. She can dry out in all manner of creeks and quiet places, away from the madding crowd. Actually, he says away from the maddening crowd. You're wrong, it's the madding crowd. But there you go. Figures to hand suggest that if we concentrate the sailing season into... Oh, no, he's talking about the weather on the Thames here. Figures to hand suggest that if we concentrate the sailing season into 1 hour, there would be 2 or 3 minutes of flat calm, 30 minutes with winds force 1, 2 or 3, 20 minutes force 4, and 1.5 minutes of force 6 to 7, with a little force 8. That's interesting way of calming things out. He talks about the importance of cruising to windward. In fact, windward performance is far less important to the cruising man than is often thought. If the worst comes to the worst, you can always use an engine to help you to get to windward and leave the fumes astern. If you use an engine downwind, fumes overtake the vessel and envelop the whole boat to produce the nearest a sailor can get to the delights of being stuck in a traffic jam. From high water on Friday evening, and there we go. From high water on Friday evening to high water on Sunday evening is about 50 hours. If I can find 1 knot of tide to help me on my way and average 2 knots through the water, this distance can be covered in just over 30 hours. Which leaves some 17 or 18 hours for eating, sleeping or just lazing about. Okay. A weekend capability of 100 miles is the passport to unlimited enjoyment in this wonderful area. From high water on Friday evening to high water on Sunday evening is about 50 hours. If I can find 1 knot of tide to help me on my way and average 2 knots through the water, this distance can be covered in just 30 hours, which leaves some 17 or 18 hours for eating, sleeping or just lazing about. Drying moorings tend to be cheaper than those with water in all states of the tide, and thus the inevitable choice for many small boat owners. Alternate weekends, my mooring is dry when I arrive on Friday evening, and I cannot leave until some time between 3 hours before and 3 hours after the next high water. Therefore, I need a boat of covering 100 miles in a weekend and shallow enough to enable me to explore the heads of creeks and rivers wherever men traded under sail in years long gone. She must have a good performance in light airs to enable me to sail around the outer sandbanks in fine weather, and sturdy enough to get me out of trouble when it blows up suddenly. One last item. She must be weatherly enough to beat the length of the Wallet Channel between Harwich and the River Colne on one flood tide. Which is how he wound up with shoal water. Then he goes on about the shoal waters, and she's cold moulded. The way they used to build fireflies. Talks about the gaff rig, which is also an excellent rig, gunter rig. Got some little charts here so that you can see. Learning the area. Man is a land animal with an instinctive fear of the sea, not sure, however much they may love the boats in which he sails upon it. In fact, sailing is a very safe sport. The most dangerous part of the weekend trip is over once you drive your car off the Queen's Highway into the club car park and climb on board the boat. On an average weekend, 30 or 40 people will be killed on the roads before you step onto dry land again. You know you'll not be one of them, which is more than any landlubber can say. Few boats flounder at sea. The trouble comes inshore when land and water mix, and nowhere is the mix more intricate than in the wide triangular estuary of the River Thames between London Bridge, Orfordness and the North Foreland. Learning the area is a long job, but an infinitely rewarding one. The reward is quite simply safe sailing, and plenty of it. Study the charts by all means, read every book you can get hold of about the area, but none of it really sinks in until you're afloat and begin to feel your way out to sea. Shore marks a few, the Naze Tower, the radar towers on Foulness and the Isle of Grain power station chimney, which gives us a fine mark at the entrance to the River Medway. Of course, all this is completely academic. We've got GPS now. So I'm going to skip this chapter. The poor relation of the navigation system is the broom or withy, a long pole cut from the hedgerow, trimmed but not topped, and fixed into the mud. They're usually, but not always, visible at high water, but some cover. The withy marks exactly what the chap who put it there intended it to mark. As they have a limited life, uncertain prospects of renewal, and are easily knocked over by passing craft, they're not marked on charts. Don't let your craft drift against them or hit them with the boom. A line of withies often indicates low water springs. A profusion of them all over a creek is a sure indication of oyster beds, and there's usually a weather-beaten notice somewhere indicating no mooring. Individual withies can mean anything from a boat that sank last month to a heap of stone for the sea wall that has lain there unused since the 30s. The only way to sort out withies is to sail the creeks early with the young flood before the banks cover, and see where they are. 1 or 2 hours after low water, the channels are already full, while the mud flats are still uncovered. That is one of my great joys, great joys. The actual time will vary with each locality, but the water can be 4, 5 or even 6 feet deep. Half an hour later the mud is covered, and it's impossible for the stranger to tell where the channels run. One river does try to be more helpful, the River Ald above Aldborough, where the winding channel to Snape, I've been up there, is marked with withies topped by red cans, yes, old bean cans painted red to be left to port, and green flags to starboard. They've now been replaced with milk containers. Apart from aiding navigation, withies add immensely to the charm of the lonely creeks. They must be the oldest form of navigation marks and have a venerable, even prehistoric air about them. Bits of seaweed catching the twigs on the top, and the sun and the salt air bleaches them white, gliding along with the tide in misty moonlight as ghostly fingers tremble in the current, is a never-to-be-forgotten experience. In spite of all these marks, sooner or later you'll go aground, so surely as night follows day. The important thing is to recognise where it's merely inconvenient and where it's downright dangerous. This brings us to the question of the lee shore, the bête noire of all seafarers. To the sailor, the lee shore is the shore on the lee side of the vessel, the shore onto which the wind is blowing. I don't need to explain that to you. But basically, when you're following a channel, follow the windward side, so that if you do go aground, the wind is trying to blow you off it again, and not blow you onto it. Because if you go ashore, even on a gentle mud bank, it's really hard to push yourself off. Once you're on a falling tide, just surrender to it. Let me show you the picture of the lee shore. Here we are. Here's this picture of the lee shore. Make my crude picture. Okay, he's not really in favour of Echo Sounder, actually. The Echo Sounder is the current toy here. See that it's aged already. But only tells you the depth if someone is watching. More vessels go aground today than before the advent of the Echo Sounder because people take more risks, but fail to maintain the high standard of vigilance such equipment needs. Far better for the shoal draft vessel to stick to the old-fashioned sounding pole, with a light cane 8 or 10 feet long. That's true, that's what I use, a bean stick. I can sound my way along the edge of the bank for miles, swinging it as easily as a walker uses a walking stick. This system never works better than when beating into a strange creek, or a known one at night or in fog. As soon as the cane touches the mud, say 5 or 6 feet, then slap the helm over and the little vessel comes round onto the other tack and heads for deep water. It is one case afloat in which you cannot go wrong. Once you run aground on a falling tide, at least you have plenty of time to study the area thoroughly. In fact, there's much to be said for going aground deliberately to study the area at low water, but no one will ever believe you. There's no pleasanter way of getting to know a new drying harbour than to arrive outside before low water in time to beach and spend an hour exploring the entrance on foot. It helps a lot if it's sand and gravel, but even muddy harbours have a gut or rill with the last of the water draining away over a hard bottom. If in doubt about the depth, remember that, as a general rule, a steep shore means deep water close in, and a shallow bank means shallow water. In other words, the angle of the beach or bank probably continues under the water. Smelling deep water and shallows is an art which can only be acquired over the years. And on the Thames estuary you have to, because once you're up to ankles you can't see your toes. It really is thick water. Shallow water will cause a steep wake rising behind the transom, possibly muddy water at that. So when you're going along a shallow bank that curves in, when you look behind you can see your wakes doing weird stuff behind you. Spits, bars or isolated shallow patches can sometimes be spotted by watching the appearance of the water. A smooth patch with a popple down tide is a certain sign of shallow water. The shallow patch is under the smooth water, not under the popple. Lastly, beware of following other vessels unless you're certain that they draw more water than you do. Okay, choosing an anchorage or overnight mooring. Of course, in small harbours, you go wherever the harbour master allocates you a berth, and the same applies in marinas. This simplifies the problem, and there's a breed of sailor emerging who merely sails from one marina to the next. I've even seen it suggested that some yachts could become uninhabitable if they didn't plug into mains electricity once every 24 hours. He doesn't mind picking up anchorage. The good thing about a small boat is, as well, you can pick up any mooring, because there's not going to be a mooring which is designed for anything less than 16-20 feet. In most anchorages there are some moorings that are not in current use. Evidence of this is the mooring line hanging from the top of the buoy. If it is slimy with weed, you can bet your bottom boots that it hasn't been out of the water and onto the foredeck of a boat for months. Don't be put off by the home tonight syndrome. The chap who put it on his buoy is probably laying on someone's mooring in the next river this night. For sound, undisturbed sleep, nothing beats drying out for the night though. Of course, it can only be done when the high tide occurs morning and evening, neeks in my area. I suppose you just run her up the beach, was the opening remark by a deep water friend of mine. Nothing could be further from the truth. Choose carefully. The bottom must be level. If you plan to go ashore once the tide is gone, it must be firm enough to walk on. Most important of all, it must be free of stakes, large stones and discarded Austin 7 engines. The old bargeman's trick of arriving before the patch on which you plan to dry covers is the real answer. But often the small boatman only looks for a spot after the ebb has set in. Seaweed with bubbles in the leaves only grows on solid material, never on mud. Didn't know that. I should remember that. Talks about weather forecast. Well, we've got that 24 hours a day. Tricks of the trade. One goes east and one goes west on the very same wind that blows. It isn't the gales, it's the set of the sails which determines the way that she goes. This age-old rhyme sums up the ability of the sailor to make the best of whatever Mother Nature chooses to serve up. Over centuries of seafaring, man has come up with all sorts of skills and techniques. Many of them have been forgotten and then rediscovered. Rule 1 is to work the tides. Why refuse a free lift just because it means starting earlier or later than the accepted office hours? Remember, it's not a choice of fair tide or no tide. If the tide isn't with you, it must be against you. Think of the escalators on the underground. Sometimes you have 3 choices, up, down and a stationary one. At sea, there are only 2 to choose from. How many people walk up the down escalator? If the key to a certain trip is the full use of a fair tide somewhere along the route, make certain that you allow plenty of time to get there by the time it turns in your favour. Nothing is more frustrating than struggling against a tide that has already begun to run against you, knowing that if only you'd been started out a little earlier and got round to the other channel before it turned, that same tide would be helping you on your way instead of hindering you. A chap at the club was telling me how unkind fate had been to him. The flood tide had been against him all the way from the River Medway to the Spitway, where he'd hoped to pick up a fair tide into the River Blackwater. By the time he got to the Spitway, it was high water and the tide turned against him for the rest of the voyage. Just didn't have the heart to point out that if he'd left the Medway 6 hours earlier, or 6 hours later, he would have had a fair tide all the way. Of course, this will mean sailing in the hours of darkness, a frightening experience at first, but one soon overcomes that and settles down to enjoy it as an important part of the sailing game. People used to well-lit streets just don't realise how well their eyes can adapt to darkness once they're given the chance. The mast, the halyards and the sails are clearly visible, even when there's no moon. In over 30 years of sailing, I can only think of 2 nights when mist and rain made it impossible to see the shapes of the waves. The secret is to cherish your night vision by avoiding all bright lights. Try to avoid sailing hard and fast in the dark. In any case, it's a long-established practice to snug down at night, taking in any kites you may have put up during the day. Reduction to soundings is great fun at evening classes, but a little tedious afloat. I use the teapot method when finding my way through shallows with a rising tide in light weather. Sail as far as you can and anchor. Put the kettle on, and while it boils, study the water and dry mud ahead and take careful bearings. By the time I've made the tea and drunk it, the rise of the tide will equal the draught of my boat and I can sail where I saw water when I anchored. Another trick which I dare not recommend but which I do shamelessly in calm conditions is to use the plate as an audible echo sounder and instant draft reducer. I do that, I bump along, I just sail along until the plate hits and then I tack away. Pull it up a bit just so I don't bend it. Keeping dry. Experience as a father has taught me that if a baby cries, the odds are that it is a wet nappy. It's an attitude that doesn't change much with the years. We're lucky today to have such a wide selection of waterproof clothing to choose from. Buy the best and look after them well. No, I don't agree. Buy the cheapest. Don't leave them encrusted with salt and crushed in a locker on Sunday evening when you leave the boat. Wash them regularly to remove the salt and leave them spread out in a well-ventilated place. It never ceases to amaze me how much time some yachtsmen spend wrapped up like oven-ready turkeys when there's not a chance in 100 of a drop of spray. Even when alone, I like to get underway before skinning up and to chuck them off before bringing up. Even the lightest and best-cut skins are cumbersome to at least some degree and inhibit free movement, so essential on a small boat. Leaving them in the cockpit whenever possible is a simple safety measure. Inevitably your hands will get wet when handling wet ropes, but don't let them stay that way, for wet hands soon become sore hands. Dry them each time they get wet, either on newspaper or one of the modern synthetic window cloths. Incidentally, a newspaper dries much better when it gets slightly damp, doesn't it? The back of the hand on the tiller must get wet in rain, but it should be possible to keep the palm dry. Regular use of Neutrogena cream will prevent both soreness and cracking. Carry nail clippers and use them regularly, for a torn nail can be agony for days. Hands have a busy time afloat. They're worth taking care of. The cold that's most demoralising is the cold that comes through your seat. A waterproof cushion is the answer here, but how many boats carry them? Whenever I buy a new... What's that? How many boats carry them? I have 2. The other thing he does is he also talks about carpeting the inside of the boat. I put these down temporarily. This is a runner. Makes a big difference. And during the day, when I'm sailing, I lift it up. Talk about an East Coast sailor. I cannot recall a season with more than 2 days when it rained most of the day. Now, come on lads, this is Scotland. Bloody rains most of the day, quite often. No dinghy. Chapter 10, no dinghy. Perhaps the biggest problem for the small boat sailor is the dinghy with which he can get to and from the shore when the boat is on a mooring or anchor. It's possible to build a little cockleshell which tows well and will carry 2 people ashore, provided that neither of them sneezes en route. Such a craft will prove useless to get to and from your moorings with a load of gear. He walks to his boat, which is great if you can do it. When I was in Wells, it was on sand, and I would walk to the boat. I would arrive at low tide and walk out to the boat. There was a dinghy there, so if I can only arrive at high tide, then I would nick somebody else's dinghy, ask them if I could nick it, and I had my own oars and rowlocks. Kneecap navigation. Let's be honest, my kind of navigation is not really navigation at all. Strictly speaking, it's pilotage, controlling the movements of the boat by reference to visible marks on the coast and fixed and floating marks at sea. So, yeah, that's what I've been doing. Compasses. See, I've drawn a line through there because it's irrelevant. Navigation stuff means nothing now. Drawn on a book. Bad boy. My daughter would be proud of me. Talks about racing boys. How often one sees the racing man buy a cruiser once his family comes along and set off down the river confident that his branch of the sport is easy after the cut and thrust of racing. Suddenly he finds himself up the creek without a paddle, and it dawns on him that the sideboard at home, groaning under the weight of chromium-plated crockery, is no use in this game. By the time he picks up his mooring again, his wife and family have been scared out of their lives and put off sailing for years, perhaps forever. It could be so different with careful planning and preparation. Don't be too ambitious. Aim to reach out a little further than you have done before, but also have alternatives if conditions are unfavourable. Always have a plan B, because plan B could very easily become your plan A. Remember the old formula: 1/3 for your time outward bound, 2/3 to get home again, which is good. You can always shorten your outward trip, but you'll have no choice on the length of the trip home. Okay, so it's a great book. Great book. You should read it. I'm going to leave you with At the Winds Come. And it stopped drizzling. Good. I'm going to leave you with Charles Stocks, Shoalwater's The 6 Rules. Never miss a fair wind and a fair tide. Such conditions don't come often. Make most of them. Never miss a chance to brew up. You may not need a drink immediately, but it may be a long time before the next chance. Keep dry as long as possible. Better still, stay dry. Watch fatigue. As you get tired, cold and hungry, and possibly a little scared, check and recheck your judgments and decisions. Be especially careful when you cease to be tired and feel you could just sail on forever. If at first you don't succeed, give up. There'll always be another chance to complete the voyage you have set your heart on. Leave the bash on regardless stuff to the ocean racing boys. They have the boats and the crews to do it. You haven't. Please don't scream for help unless you're in real danger. The chap who calls out the rescue services when his burgee halyard breaks drives one more nail in the coffin of our freedom to sail, as and when we please. It's very precious in these bureaucratic times. If you cannot stand the heat, keep out of the kitchen. You cannot stand the trials and tribulations of the high seas, please take up croquet. Good on you, Charles. You're a hero.